Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scicomm Monday. I'm your host, Nicole Wood. If you're new to Scicomm Monday, we try to make this as engaging a platform as possible, so please feel free to send in all of your questions and comments via the integrated chat module. If you're watching this on replay, please send in your comments via our various Twitter handles. You can contact me either by the Scicomm Monday handle or by my Wildlife BioGal handle on Twitter. Today we're going to be having a lot of fun talking about where science and religion can kind of mix, and we're going to be dealing with evolution and the research of how we educate those learning about evolution. So we're going to have Dr. Amanda Glaze on. She goes by Evo PhD on Twitter, and she's from Georgia Southern University. And so I'm really happy to have her on because it's going to be, I think, just a lot of fun today. So Amanda, thanks for being on the broadcast.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited about it. So looking forward to it.
So why don't you give us a little bit of background about, your academic background, where you're coming from, so people kind of know where it is that you're jumping into this whole mess of religion and science and your research with it.
So my background is a little bit of a mixed background. Came from actually Southern politics and law and ended up in the sciences through education. So my research focus has shifted quite a bit over the years, most recently at the University of Alabama, working on evolutionary biology and science education. And so as a part of that, some of those late night lab conversations have led to this whole new arena of conversation about the conflict that people have with topics in science. So public perceptions, especially in places like Alabama, when it came down to evolution and religion and what people believe and what people were taught and the experiences that they've had. So it's kind of been a rabbit hole, so to speak. It's taken on a life of its own in a lot of new directions.
Yeah, it's always one of those, fun things of where you start your education somewhere and then you end up somewhere else. And it's just like you just keep on going down, like you said, into that rabbit hole. And you're just like wondering, where is this going to end up? And all of a sudden you look around and you're like, this is not where I was expecting to be, but I don't mind being here. So, because I can relate to that because I went to my master's, I wanted to study cougars, and next thing I know, I'm studying mute swans, but I couldn't be happier, where it is I ended up. So. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your research that you're doing? Because I've been finding it very interesting. You're dealing with the education of evolution in schools, everywhere from elementary all the way up through college. So why don't you just dive right into that and kind of give us the background of all that? We'll be here for about a half hour while you give us the background.
It's like, everybody settle in. Here we go.
Yeah.
It actually started out with a little bit of interest in future teachers. So it was a matter of looking at what the students that wanted to be teachers were thinking about, or if they were even thinking about evolution. And so it was going to be this little tiny study, just something of interest on the side, and get into it and start finding these patterns with not only future teachers, but with other students in the sciences. So in this first study that I did, all of the participants were science majors of some variety or the other. So they were either biology majors, biochem, or science education. And so with that group, they were all upper level students. So we're talking about our 400, 500 level junior, senior level classes. And looking at the data, pulling this, looking at how they're doing in their classes, a pattern came up as far as what they knew relative to evolution. So we would assume that people at this level would be really comfortable with evolution. They would have the basics. You give them a high school level evolution test and everything's going to be fine. Their average score was 44%.
Wow.
And we know that if a student makes a 44 out of 100, exactly. And so if a student's making 44 out of 100 on their test in our class, obviously they're not getting it. We're doing something wrong. They're just, they're not understanding there's a major issue. And again, these are students in junior and senior level biology programs who are majors in science. So it really got me started thinking about some of the pathways that we get to that point. And if you look at a lot of programs, whether you're a biology major, like I was at one point in time, or you're an education major, there's a lot of stopgap in between when it comes to which courses you take. So you usually have things like cell biology, genetics, maybe ecology that are required courses. But what we're finding is a lot of places don't have evolution class that is required. And then once people get beyond the required courses, they get to choose whatever they want to choose based on either their organism of study or a more general pathway, just courses of interest if they're in education. So there are a lot of people coming out, even with degrees in the sciences, that don't have the background that they need in regards to evolution. Now, why is that an issue other than, of course, they're majors? For a lot of people, they don't even have the college opportunity to be exposed to evolution. So we've got people coming in the door as undergraduates that we assume have scientific knowledge, right, by virtue of being admitted to college. And then they get in their classwork and evolution is covered in 2 days in their intro classes, and then they never take another class on it. So that backtracked it to secondary education. So looking at what's being taught, whether it's being taught, and again, finding the same pattern. We have teachers who are not teaching evolution because it conflicts with their beliefs. We have teachers who are teaching evolution, but they're teaching it in a way that's a little bit sketchy. Things like nature of science misunderstandings. Students having this idea that theories become elevated to laws once they're proven, which of course is completely inaccurate. So all of these different issues going on. And again, this is where I said the rabbit hole pops up, because each time new things would come up, and as you start picking at the threads and pulling to try to find out, okay, what's the common issue, it backtracks it a little bit further and backtracks it a little bit further. And so, I've got my hands in a lot of different pots right now when it comes to research, simply because there are so many different facets to understanding the issue. And then when you look at the greater issue of it, when you look at the actual goal of my research, which is not, okay, let's just make everybody accept evolution. That would be great. But the goal is science literacy. It's to get people to even be able to come to the table and have those conversations. And so that's when we get into those intersections of science and society that I talk about a lot, where we talk about beliefs and how, it's not a war for evolution, it's a war for science literacy. And so, if you've been around me for more than 5 minutes, you've heard me always say, regardless of what your beliefs are, regardless of what your culture is, regardless of, whatever else you subscribe to, it's important that everyone has science literacy. And so sometimes that requires us stepping back and understanding that background and being able to look at multiple sides of what's going on so that we can impact that on a larger scale.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I just want to do a quick shout out. We had some people join in on us or join in on the conversation. Keisha, glad you could make it. So glad you could join in. So I think that's her first time ever watching Scicomm Mondays. I know she just started following us, so I'm glad that she could tune in, because she was like, made it. So just wanted to give her a special shout out for tuning in. And then just a reminder for everyone out there, if you have any questions or comments for Dr. Amanda Glaze or myself, please send them in via the integrated chat module, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. So it is Keisha's first time watching Scicomm Monday. So yes, we're glad you could watch. But yeah, that was one of the things that you were saying with evolution classes. I don't believe I ever took an evolution class through my whole college experience at all, both undergrad and grad school. I mean, there was some elements of evolution included within the classes, but nothing that was really directed just for evolution. And having science literacy is definitely, especially it seems like in today's society, something that is so lacking and something that we really need to make sure that everyone has, because when I'm just talking to people who don't necessarily have that science background, the information and the knowledge base that they have about different topic areas, it always surprises me how they don't have it. And it's just like, what can I do to be able to help them understand those things so that way they can understand the bigger, broader pictures of everything. And that's a very tough thing to do. So here we got a question coming in. How can you tell if someone cares to understand the truth or just wants to support their beliefs? So I'm gonna let you handle that one.
And so I drive people crazy with semantics. Science is not a pursuit of the truth per se. That's more of a philosophical realm. And with what I do, I do not spend my time trying to target creationists to force them to hear, the evangelical version of evolution. That is not the goal. So I always explain to people that when you're looking at things, if you look at it like a bell curve, you've got your hardcore staunch creationists. They are never going to change their mind. It could happen right in front of their faces. They're not going to think about it. You have your staunch evolutionists that no matter what anything happens, they will always be evolutionists. But in the middle, you've got all of these other people that could really fall in either direction depending on the interactions that they have with people. And that's our goal. Our goal is not to fight with trolls and, attack religion. My goal in what I do is to reach the masses with the conceptualization that there is not a dichotomy there. You don't have to be either scientific or religious. And I know that's a contention point for a lot of people. Now, I always have to disclaim that doesn't mean I advocate for the blending of the two or anything else. But usually if you create a space where you can have those kind of conversations, the people that really care to understand, the people that are interested, even people who came from a background like mine, who, are deeply a part of Christian belief. I was born and reared Southern Baptist in a ministry family and missions family. So it's a matter of being able to have a dialogue. And so if you establish yourself as someone that can have that dialogue safely with people from all sides of the aisle, you'll find that the people that are interested in asking questions will be comfortable asking their questions. Sadly, what seems to happen in a lot of cases is that a lot of the people that are representing science in the public are very vocally anti-religious, or they're very vocal about not asking questions, or they don't have that understanding of what is really at risk for people when they have a deeply rooted belief system, whether it's just cultural, whether it's specifically religious. Those are deeply rooted in our worldview. And so we're talking about having a conversation that for some people literally means losing part of your identity, losing your social structure, losing your family. I mean, we're not just talking about having some conversation about photosynthesis, for example. There's not a conflict there. There's not anything that could be lost there. And so it's always a matter of recognizing what's happening on both sides and being able and willing to listen and not be judgmental of those things and not be condescending when somebody asks you questions. That really opens the door.
Yeah, one of our audience members was saying to focus more on what we share versus what the differences are, I think is kind of what you're going for. And it is a really big, important point, because sometimes we really do just focus on those differences rather than what it is that we're sharing and our understanding of the world and where we're both, coming from when you're having that conversation with somebody. And then another comment that came in too was, it seems like we're driving more, like a lot of times when we talk about evolution, so many times it seems like it's just the man versus monkey kind of debate that gets thrown up there.
Right.
How is it that you can incorporate other aspects of evolution to help people understand, things like, sedimentary deposits, as far as soil getting laid down and things like that. So it's like, how do you try to include that in people's education and not just, say focus on the big, man versus monkey kind of part of evolution?
And the funny thing that in mentioning that is that, if you look at the Gallup polls, Gallup has been running a poll on this since the early 80s that looks at creationism and beliefs and things like that. And it's changing a little bit, but it's not changed as much as you would think over a 30 plus year time period. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we find, whether it's, looking specifically at evolutionary acceptance measures in different populations or looking at those public measures, is that really the man versus monkey thing is the problem. There are plenty of people that are of evolution up into the point that humans are involved. So they can literally accept that everything else evolves, every other living thing. But then when you start talking about human evolution, that's when you start stepping on toes. And so, with a lot of these measures, we have questions that specifically apply to human evolution. So questions, for example, the mate is a widely used acceptance measure, and there's criticisms of it because it does lean heavily, some of its questions into creationist questions. For example, things like the Earth is less than 20,000 years old versus the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, etc. But what we find is there are plenty of people that will answer favorably. They will answer acceptingly of evolution, of everything up until the point you start talking about humans changing. And that's why we get into this science and society thing. Because when you look at knowledge, when you look at learning, we have various levels of knowledge, basic facts, the understanding, you're able to apply those facts and do something with it. We have beliefs, which are things that we personally invest in. Then we have acceptance, which is empirical investment, right? So semantics really matter on that, because I tell people, my name is Amanda Glaze. I don't believe in evolution, and neither should you. Why? Because evolution is not a matter of belief. It's a matter of acceptance. So it's one of those things we have to look at the dynamics there. With each subject in science, I keep going back to photosynthesis. The more people learn about photosynthesis, the more likely they are to be accepting of photosynthesis. But that doesn't happen with evolution. It's perfectly acceptable, well, not acceptable, but it's perfectly normal in a data set to have a lot of outliers in very weird places with evolution, because knowledge does not impact acceptance the way it does with anything else. And that's one of the reasons why our approach to dealing with evolution, teaching and learning is not working. Because if all you're doing is throwing out facts, but yet all the research is telling us facts don't make a difference statistically, then you have to regroup, you have to adjust your approach, and you have to step back and look at, okay, what really is impacting. So, I've got this massive data set, something like 20,000 plus data points. And when we start doing these little snapshot pulls, just like with the previous data sets, we're finding the exact same patterns. They're the same in middle school students, high school students, university students, whether they're majors or non-majors. They're the same in classroom teachers, and even in some university faculty that have been looked at in a study. And that is that there are plenty of people who are extremely knowledgeable about evolution, extremely knowledgeable, 90 to 100% on a content examination. Yet when it comes to acceptance of evolution, when they take an acceptance measure, they look at the questions, they think about it in terms of their worldview, and they actively reject based on the status of their beliefs. The converse is also true. There are plenty of people that know very little accurately about evolution, but who completely actively accept everything that they see relative to what they've heard about evolution, simply because that is how they believe. And so we have this new dynamic, this worldview, personal culture, and identity dynamic that is a very strong impacting factor on whether or not people are willing to accept evolution. And so some of the things that we've found that do actually work on that are things like talking about what you were saying a minute ago, different ways of knowing. The fact that there are different ways that we view the world. There is a scientific lens. There are religious lenses, and helping people differentiate and separate the two, because so many people think science is here beliefs, and that's all we do is, sit in a lab somewhere and try to prove that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, I have to say, and all the times that I've done anything, I probably sat in a lab for about 2 minutes, and that was never the conversation of topic of anything. So
exactly.
So just a reminder to everyone out there, we're talking with Dr. Amanda Glaze about the education of evolution with students anywhere from elementary up through college, and her research. So for everyone there who is watching, please send in all your comments and questions via the integrated chat module, and we'll do our best to answer your questions and get that in. It's definitely, we've really appreciated all the comments that have come in so far when it's related to the broadcast. But so anyways, um, why don't you tell us a little bit more about when is it that you really are like hitting those students? Like when is it like that they're pretty much set in their beliefs? Like, because I always wonder, like they always say, like, if you hit someone before middle school with such and such topic, you're not going to really change their mind. Like, where is that like kind of cutoff? Are you finding a cutoff at all when it comes to students and their beliefs in, or their acceptance of evolution along that spectrum of education?
So it's a very interesting dynamic, and what a lot of people don't understand is that when we talk about acceptance of evolution, we're also looking at interpersonal beliefs. We're looking at worldviews, and worldview is an identity construct. Identity construct. So we're talking about formulation of these worldviews and these lenses through which everything else is filtered at a very, very, very young age. And so a lot of people that I speak with don't have the background that I have, and I've had to sit and explain to them, I grew up Southern Baptist in rural Alabama in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. If the doors of the church were open, we were there. That is where you play sports. That is where you have dinner. That is where you go to see your friends on Wednesday nights. Everything was tied to church. And so the things that were taught in church had precedent for, 6 years before I ever started to school. And that's the case for a lot of people. So when we start talking about the idea of restructuring worldview, it actually bothers me because, first of all, it posits that one worldview is more valued and more important than another. And it can't be the goal of science education to deconstruct a person's identity. That cannot be the goal of education in K-12 education. It's not reasonable. It's not ethical. And so what we have to start thinking about is the idea is to plant seeds of scientific thinking in elementary school through inquiry, in middle school through hands-on learning, and in high school through advanced thinking exercises to not only teach students the difference between different ways of knowing. For example, that science can only consider physical evidence to explain events in a physical world, whereas religion uses metaphysical, supernatural explanations, things like that. And teach them to differentiate between those things, but also to teach them about the nature of science. The idea about laws and theories and what those things are and how science is as a field never focused on proof. There's no such thing as proven in science, right? And all of these things, it turns out, are the keys to increasing evolutionary acceptance. It's not attacking someone's beliefs. It's not trying to deconstruct their beliefs and show them that evolution is right and their beliefs are wrong. What it is actually teaching them what science is and what scientists do. And that opens the door for them to be comfortable even having those conversations. So as far as a cutoff, we want to foster that curiosity that is science from a young age. And if we do that, not only are we fighting against the distrust that a lot of people have for scientists, but we're opening the door to bigger conversations later. So, in talking with other researchers, this has been something that we have wrestled with for the last 5 years. At which level does it become appropriate for acceptance to be your goal? And I would say not until the university level. You want to build a foundation in K-12 for them to be willing to learn about science and start thinking scientifically. But the goal of K-12 education cannot be restructuring of worldview. That's something that, they can come into later on. But again, it's not about breaking down someone's existing worldview. It's about building a scientific worldview into the worldview of everyone, regardless of whatever else they bring to the table. That's the only way we're going to impact science literacy. It can't be us versus them.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point for sure, because it is very easy to kind of like forget about laying those building blocks that you need to be able to like help teach them about it and just say, oh, you need to accept this right now versus like, okay, let's build that up so that way when we tell you this is the way that the world is working, you're more likely to accept it versus like you just tell them that this is the way it is.
Right.
So we had a
And
couple
even
comments.
getting
Oh, go
people
ahead.
to the
Sorry.
table.
No,
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just saying, even getting people to the table is difficult if you don't first open the door to that conversation. If you walk in the door guns blazing, for lack of a better word, anti-religion, anti-belief, this is a science class, we're just going to do science, your beliefs don't matter. You'll be amazed how many students who have beliefs, who feel attacked, who shut down. And then another cluster of students who just don't like the tone and the feel that brings to a setting, who also shut down. So it's about opening up and really making people willing to have that conversation by how you approach it.
Yeah, that's a good point because I know I definitely feel that when I have a place that I can be open and talking and engage with, my instructors and with my fellow classmates, it really does help me feel more keen to join in on the conversation versus just sitting there quietly and just hoping no one notices that I'm not, wanting to engage and I can sit back and, you know, keep on my own beliefs. So, but yeah, one of
Absolutely.
the comments that we had coming in, and just a reminder for everyone out there, if we don't get to your comment and it's a question or something you really want to answer in, because we are having a fair number of them flying through right now, so they are going to be very difficult to keep up with. Please feel free to resubmit it, and we have no problems with having those questions re-asked over and over again until we actually get to it, because it's hard to keep track of all these coming in, and it's great to see all these comments. I really do love them. But if we don't happen to get to your question during the broadcast, then tweet us, at our various handles afterwards. You can reach Dr. Amanda Glaze at Evo PhD on Twitter, and you can reach myself either at the Scicomm Monday or at the Wildlife BioGal handle. So yes, definitely keep sending those questions in, and we'll see what we can do to get them all answered. But yeah, one of the comments that came in was really interesting, got me thinking, was they were saying how at their schools that they're only taught about evolution at the end of the semester rather than having integrated in with their programs that they have. And how do you how it's taught, how do you find that really, impacts those scores of people doing better with accepting, if it's just kind of like thrown in as an afterthought, or if it's really truly like integrated as part of with that science literacy? Does that really make that big of a difference with people accepting it?
It really does, and it actually has multiple benefits when it's integrated. I mean, first of all, it should be integrated throughout because it's the unifying theory of biology. If you're not integrating it throughout, it's problematic. But the big thing that happens with that integration is you take away, you really diffuse the situation. So, for example, I was a classroom teacher for, close to a decade before I went into university work, and teaching, whether it was middle grades or secondary sciences. If you wait and teach evolution as this unit at the end, because what happens if you talk to teachers is they'll tell you the reason it's at the end is because they're hoping they won't get to it.
Oh,
I
that's a
mean, and
really
quite
interesting
frankly, that
point. Yeah, I never
they
would
will
have
tell
thought
you,
about that.
you know,
Wow. That's
they
that's
put it at
crazy
the
to
end,
think, but it's, yeah, that makes so much sense though.
but yes, they teach everything else. The ones that are not comfortable with evolution will teach everything else and wait and have evolution as their last unit in hopes that they won't get to it. And that's coming from hundreds of teachers that I've interviewed. Now, the other element of that is that when evolution is set up as a unit, you almost set yourself up for confrontation, because number one, you're compartmentalizing this thing as this big bad, event that's coming. It's coming. It's coming. We're getting closer to the unit, closer to the unit. Whereas if you approach it as being woven through everything, by the time you get to whatever full unit you have, everything is so defragmented. The stigma to it, the fear of it, that preparation, that I'm getting ready because we're going to talk about evolution, and I'm going to challenge my teacher, or I'm really nervous about teaching evolution because it conflicts with my beliefs. It diffuses that because it's no longer this shock and awe campaign with students. First of all, we talk about how things change. We talk about, different theories like endosymbiont theory and cell biology. We talk about the 7 characteristics of life and how descent with modification, that change is, something that must be there for life to occur. And then, you get to that point and they're like, oh, that's what that was. And it's not a big deal anymore. I hate to equate it to drinking in Europe. Some of my family is German, and they didn't understand why the teenagers here were getting so drunk and stuff like that when people were younger. And it's like, drinking is not a big deal for them because they can start drinking when they're younger. I know it's a horrible analogy, but I mean it's
But
the same
it
thing.
does kind of hold true
If
though. Like
it's
you kind of get used to it, and so it's not that like, oh my
right,
goodness moment of, and that's kind of like how
right,
it is a lot of times for college students when they go away. It's just like, oh my goodness, I could do this now. Let's just take it to like
right,
the
go
nth
out,
degree
right,
versus like they've grown up with it and gotten used to it. And the same thing with evolution is like, as long as you get that little bit on and on throughout the years, it's
exactly.
not going to be that big of a, like you said, a shock when it comes around. So,
Exactly. And you see now our new standards, the next gen science standards, has elements of evolution as low as first and second grade because it's that important. And I mean, it's elements that, little kids are perceptive. They pick up on change. They're curious. They're not afraid of these things until someone makes them afraid of it. And so, we have these opportunities to start having conversations and to start making observations in the natural world with small children, and they can make sense of it. I have grandmother fish. I read it to my 5-year-old. He loves it. It makes sense to him. It's logical. He thinks it's amazing that he's related to everything because it's so cool. And does he have a tail too? And we kind of beat that out of kids, unfortunately.
yeah, you got
but
me
but there
now
are
wanting to
efforts, of
go ask
course.
my niece and nephew what it is that they've been taught, because my nephew's in fifth grade and my niece just started second grade. And it's like, I know I've had some kind of conversations with my nephew about, the past, being, so long ago, how there used to be megalodons swimming by his, window of where his house is now. There would have been a sea there and things like that. So we've had discussions about, the long termness of, Earth and everything like that. But it'd be really interesting to know something specific as evolution. What do they actually know and what
Mhm.
have they been taught? It's, while they're, definitely children who are basically, just like me, who grew up, understanding science and things like that, they both want to be scientists when they grow up, but it still would be interesting to know, like, what have they been taught even in a more liberal setting that, they are in. So,
Mhm.
uh,
And you see, that's something that's kind of disconcerting because what we find is in elementary settings right now, because of the testing that takes place, science has really been put on the back burner. So there are a lot of places where teachers are not getting to teach science every day, and students are in fourth, fifth, and sixth grade sometimes before they have a regular science class that actually meets every day. And I mean, it's a terrible disservice because we're losing so much time with them, not to indoctrinate them to science, but we're losing this valuable time to foster that curiosity because a lot of times by the time they get to middle school, they're not familiar with science. They don't know what the nature of science is. They are so used to everything being math, reading, test, regurgitate. Somebody the other day called it intellectual bulimia. You binge and binge and binge and binge on information, you regurgitate it back, and then, and that's it, you lose it. And so we're losing a lot of opportunities to engage students in the actual practices of science as well. And that's where, nature of science is huge. And that ties in with the new standards and how we're trying to shift the classroom from the lecture style that we always had. Hopefully gone are the days of worksheets, gone are the days of just sitting there listening to someone give you notes, and we're actually having students do the discovery, do the observation, do the science. Because you ask any scientist out there, there's not a one of them, I mean, unless you're just strange, but there's not a one of them that will say, well, I became a scientist because I loved lecture. you know it's the
hey, I really
it's
did
the
like
stuff that
writing
we do
notes
in
in
the
my,
field. It's
notepad there. So like when I got to use all the multicolored pens and everything, I really did like it. But no, I did not become a scientist just because of lectures.
exactly. And so we're trying to make science more science. I mean, let kids actually do science. Let them explore. Let them ask questions, and it all ties back in. Like I said, it's a huge rabbit hole because each thing brings in another question and another question. And so now, I'm simultaneously looking at 20,000 undergraduate data points in the sciences across levels, 111 representing every state in the United States plus Puerto Rico, and looking at okay, where are our students? Where are the gaps? What are the patterns in their knowledge? What are the patterns in their acceptance? We have all of these assumptions that we make about regional differences and state differences and things like that, but we haven't had an opportunity to look at a data set that represented the entire country to finally actually know, other than, okay, well, there's this small study in New York and there's a small study in Indiana, and then there's my studies in Alabama. How do they compare? I mean, the instruments are not the same, the populations are not the same. And so this data set actually makes that possible. And, I'm data sharing with all the universities that came in because I want them to use the data, and we want to use the data in order to find out what programs are really excelling with impacting acceptance and understanding, and identifying, not where things are wrong, but where things are really going right, so that we can actually take that and use that to dynamically change what we're talking about relative to evolution and nature of science, how we're talking about it, and then, put our money where our mouth is and actually do something.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of good points. So we had a comment come in, asking if it's easier to reach students and people in the academic setting or in the public setting when it comes to acceptance of evolution. What have you found so far that seems to be easier, or is it kind of the same?
It really depends. I hate to say in academia you have a captive audience, so it's a little bit different. If you have a really good teacher who does a very good job of laying a foundation, almost every student in their class can become willing to at least listen and learn and begin to understand and think scientifically. It's a little bit different in the public sphere because of the fact that you have so many different dynamics and levels and backgrounds, and people seek out, it's confirmation bias. People seek other people that share their ideas already. And so in order to really get to people publicly, you have to be willing to go to them. I tell people one of the reasons I've been able to do the research that I've done in the southeastern U.S. is because I'm from the South. I grew up Southern Baptist. I talk the talk. I walk the walk. I understand where they're coming from as someone who, is literally a literalist, young earth creationist growing up, very devout in my faith, and having to navigate that conflict when I started learning about science. And so being able to have that conversation is really what gets me in the door with a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't be willing to talk to me.
Yeah, no, you make a really good point, because I'm from a small town, and being able to say, hey, I'm from here, I understand where you're coming from, it really does help with, being able to speak to them, versus if I was someone from the big city, quote unquote, that, they'd be less likely to listen to me. But because I've grown up here, they're going to be like, oh, well, she gets us, she understands us, she's one of us, and we're more likely to listen to her. Because I know that's the same thing with anyone who's kind of like you're much more likely to feel like, okay, they're at least going to understand where I'm coming from. And it makes it a lot easier. So oh, go ahead.
If you ask me where we need to, I was just saying, if you ask me where we need to put our money, it's in pre-service teachers. One teacher over the course of a career will impact thousands of students. So if we really want to impact science literacy and public perceptions of science, all of us, whether it's education or science, need to be investing in these future teachers, because they're the ones that will teach everyone. How few, what's the percentage of people that even go to a trade school or undergraduate university? High school teachers, middle school teachers reach everybody in the country. They are the ones that are really literally the front lines. And yet, so often we're not investing in them the way we need to for, to be able to make that change.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a good point to make, because they're, like you said, if they're the ones really going to be making the biggest impression on us, they should be the ones most knowledgeable of it and knowledgeable of how to teach people about it. So we had speaking of classes and things like that, we had someone saying how with their AP bio class there was a lot of evolution included, but their other bio classes there really wasn't a lot of evolution included. Is that something that's pretty common that you've been finding?
So the neat thing about AP Biology is AP Biology is nationally standardized regardless of state standards. So because AP has that national level test and is considered equivalent to that intro biology, it functions a lot differently. And so the national standards, if you look at them for AP Biology, do integrate evolution throughout the way we just talked about how it should be done. And so what we find is that even in AP teachers, a lot of times that may have a little bit of conflict on their own, if they don't teach evolution, their kids don't pass the AP test. So either they kind of weed themselves out by having low scores on the AP test, or they have to actively teach evolution. Now, as far as your other bio classes, a lot of times teachers get around that because, again, it's one standard out of however many. You put it to the end of the year and you cover everything else, and then maybe you run out of time conveniently, and so you don't ever get to it. But, with AP having it so heavily integrated all the way through, you really can't skip it and still have the students do well on the test. Now, interestingly enough, there's an article that's coming out in maybe a few months, maybe January, with American Biology Teacher that specifically looks at AP Biology teachers in the South as they compare to their general biology counterparts. And what we find is they're, as a general rule, they do not have higher levels of knowledge or acceptance than their counterparts. So, in that case, that national testing, that high demand, and you have to assume also the parents of AP students are going to be extremely angry if their AP students are not passing the AP test, right?
Oh yeah,
and
because
so
you put
there are
money
these
into
selective
that. You
pressures.
want them to do well. So.
Yeah, and so pardon the bad pun, but there are selective pressures that are on AP teachers to push them to teach evolution that are not there on regular teachers who might be dealing with parents who don't want to learn, don't want their kids learning about evolution, or administrators that are not supportive of teaching of evolution, or they personally are dealing with conflict that they have with evolution. So, again, so many dynamic factors come into play. But, we make assumptions that AP teachers are going to be the best and the brightest, and so they're automatically going to teach better and they're going to teach more. But what we find is they have a lot of the same hang-ups, a lot of the same struggles as any other science teacher. But, again, we start looking at those dynamic issues surrounding it, national standard, that testing, the parents that are involved, and then we start seeing factors that impact the teaching. So, it's really such a multifaceted issue as far as how do we get teachers to teach it? How do we support them in teaching? How do we get their communities to be supportive of them teaching and learning? So there is a lot of room for work. There's a lot to be done.
Yeah, so you're speaking of like the different standards, the national standards, everyone has to adhere to that for things like AP. But how do the standards vary from state to state, or maybe even district to district? Because I'm assuming the standards that we have in Michigan might be very different than what they are down in Georgia for various topics. Not just evolution, but it could be, quite different. We might be lacking on some things up here versus, Georgia might be, really just over the top and doing an amazing job versus, there may be things here in Michigan that we are really strongly, teaching our students, but maybe Georgia is lacking. How do you find that varies throughout, state to state and district to district?
So it's been really interesting in the last few years. Now, I mentioned we have national standards, and we have off and on at various points in time. Most recently in 1996, National Science Ed Standards, and then, of course, the Next Generation Science Standards came out in 2013. The thing is, even though we have national standards, they are not nationally applied across all the states. The states still have the option to, elect to take those on. And so you hear a lot of people talking about Common Core math and things like that. The Next Gen Science Standards were like the Common Core version of math. It's a national set of standards that exist. But what we find is that a lot of states do their own standards. Luckily, for example, in the state of Georgia, they do have their own Georgia Science Education Standards. However, they are very closely matched to the Next Generation Science Standards in terms of structure, in terms of function, and in terms of the elements that are covered. So that's tremendously helpful, having the supportive standards. But at the same time, we find that just having standards is not enough to ensure that it's getting taught, which is again very, very interesting. Just because we have strong standards doesn't mean that teachers are necessarily going to be teaching it, because again, selective pressure is where they are. It may be one standard out of 6 in their state standards or in the national standards. However, if they have parents that are in their faces, or their administrator is putting pressure on them and they feel like they're not going to have a job or whatever else, they don't always teach it. The standards do range very heavily. Lerner did studies in 2012, both looking at state by state how different places cover evolution, and there are some Fs. I mean, on a regular grading scale, there are states that have standards that have an F, and you could look up your state, Lerner 2012, and do evolution state standards, and it'll pull it up for you, and you can see exactly where your state stands in terms of the strength or weakness of the evolution standards.
How are schools and like the teachers that are teaching, how are they graded as far as adhering to the standards? Because you can have those standards out there, but
They're not.
Is it just through the testing? I kind of half remember going through school, like we had like the standardized test, when you're in 5th grade, and I think it was like 10th grade or something else along those lines, to see like how we all were doing. Mm-hmm. Is that really basically it as far as seeing how students are doing? Like there's no actual testing of the teachers themselves?
No, I mean, it really is it. State to state, depending on where you are, there's so much variety. Some schools have EOCs, which are end of course tests at the end of certain classes like biology. The core classes that everybody takes might have an end of course test, and they look at whether you're proficient or not proficient. But I mean, think about it theoretically. If you have 6 standards worth of information and you teach your children, 1 through 5 extremely well, but then completely avoid number 6, you can still have enough of a score to pass a test, even if you don't have proficiency in one of the standards. So, we do see some of that. Some schools use, or some states are using the ACT, the actual college entry ACT, having all of their students take that, and that's kind of their gauge of how they're doing. But as far as there being like a next gen science standards test that tests mastery of standards, there isn't one that is used, that everybody uses. There's so much autonomy state to state that, they're almost every state has their own layout of assessment of who's assessed, when they're assessed, how they're assessed. State by state has their own, often have their own measures. So it's very hard to really track and see how they're doing. And then let's just be honest, in some states, they don't really care how the students are doing when it comes to evolution. They would I would argue that there are some people that would be happier to know that their students are failing at that standard and doing well at everything else than, to really worry about it.
Yeah, I guess that, I could see that happening. If it's something that they don't accept, it could be very much where they don't care if the students are getting it. So we had a question come in a while ago that I wanted to get back to, because I think, especially since we're doing this on social media, is, things of, they were talking about using iNaturalist and other programs like that are, these social media based, applications that people can use to be able to, be a part and like join in on the science. Do you think things like that are actually going to help reach those students and other folks who might not be accepting of evolution, to get them more involved with science, and then maybe, be able to reach them that way, like kind of like those gateway applications, those gateway social media apps that we can, get to them, get them excited about science, and then get them to accept evolution? Do you think that, have you been seeing any of that, or do you think that it might be a way to go? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So anything that we can do to get kids engaged in science and thinking scientifically and thinking about science is going to help. I mean, it's obviously not going to hurt. What we find is the bridge to that gateway, so to speak, is that nature of science understanding. The idea of science is tentative, as always seeking answers, that laws tell us what happens, and then theories are the explanations of why. All of this, these huge misconceptions that people have about science that persist throughout their lifetimes, have to be addressed. They have to be addressed in the classroom. They have to be addressed in our interactions with each other. And by doing that, you open the door for greater learning. So as far as apps to explore and get people excited, does it help? Absolutely. Anything that we can do to get kids, adults, anybody being hands-on, doing citizen science, meeting scientists, having those conversations and asking questions can only help.
Yeah, I know. I mean, granted, I'm slightly biased when it comes to social media and apps, as we can all tell, since I'm doing this through social media. But I've always found like it's a really great way to reach people. My nephew, when I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, I was giving a workshop on social media, and he was there tweeting for me on my behalf. And here he is, 10 years old, learning how to do that and getting engaged. And he's already, gotten to know different scientists, outside of me, and learning about the work that they do and getting to like talk back and forth with them. And it's so great. Like my niece was able to learn how to do a project on spider monkeys. She wrote a book report about that, and she got most of the information from a scientist that we got hooked up through on Twitter, and she was asking the scientist questions. And so it's just, I think it does. It like really opens up all those avenues that, people might not have, because a lot of folks out there might have access to the internet and be able to get their information that way, where maybe their school isn't providing it for them, but they can still have that access to information. So.
Well, even apps aside, connections with scientists. We talk all the time about how people have these perceptions of scientists that are completely off base. What's the most recent one? That scientists aren't outdoorsy people. It's like, what? Really? Where do you think science is happening? So using social media, John Mead, a friend, always he does a blog for National Geographic, and he's talking about the hive mind that is social media. So really being able to address the nature of science by actually meeting scientists, by getting to talk to people about their science, by seeing scientists that look like them and are from their backgrounds. I tell people all the time, the content is not as important as the background. Because once you get the background built, once students understand what science is, that people like them are doing science, that you can have beliefs and still be scientific, that, you can love science and love God, once you get beyond all of those things, then the content takes care of itself, because then they're comfortable, then they'll ask questions, then they want to explore, then they want to solve problems. So, it is a huge dynamic, and scientists can do so much for the public just by being like you are, being like so many on social media, and just being approachable and being human, being our own selves.
Yeah, you make a good point with that, with, putting ourselves out there where the public feels comfortable with coming and asking us questions, even questions that they might be hesitant to ask, but by, saying, hey, we love having all those questions, ask away. I've seen a number of scientists have, ask me anything on Twitter, and just, for an hour, they'll answer any question that comes in via Twitter. And I think that's a great way to have the public's questions answered that they might be too afraid maybe to like ask in person. Even if you're comfortable with a scientist, asking them in person versus social media sometimes can be a big difference as well, because then you've got that the veil of the internet that you can be like, okay, I can ask my question and not worry about someone looking at me face to face. But yeah, it does, like it gives it, because how many of us knew a scientist growing up? Like my niece and nephew are very lucky that they've got me, that way they can actually engage with other scientists. But I'm trying to think of when I grew up, even though I knew about science and learned about it, like how many scientists did I know one-on-one that I could ask of things? And it's like, right now I can't think of it, so. But yeah, so as we're kind of starting to get to the close of the hour, any questions that anybody has here as we're beginning to get to the end of Scicomm Monday this week, please feel free to send those in, so that way we can get to them here at the last moment. Definitely feel free to ask your questions via the chat. And then, as said before, if we don't get to them, please send them in via Twitter to Amanda's Twitter, which is EvoPhD, or the Scicomm Monday Twitter handle, or my personal handle of Wildlife BioGal. So what are some like last minute tips you have for people out there who are acceptors of evolution, but maybe know people in their community or in their social circles, whatever it is, that they know people who don't accept evolution? How would you kind of like try to bridge that conversation and get them to like at least get the thought planted in their head, so that way they're not so adamantly against evolution?
So I'm going to go extremely Southern here and just be very blunt. Shut up. Shut up and listen. Listen. If you want an opportunity to speak to people about something that is important to you, and this applies to everything from politics to religious beliefs to evolution to anything. If you want people to listen to you, to hear what you say, and to be willing to accept what you're saying, you have to first be willing to shut your mouth and listen. And so, so much of my understanding and my background and my ability to have conversations with people from a variety of backgrounds comes simply from, my first engagement with people is not, hi, my name's Dr. Amanda Glaze. I'm involved in evolution and I'm going to convert you. That's obviously not going to open any doors, nor is, hey, by the way, I think your beliefs are dumb. And so, you're wrong and I'm right and I'm going to win. So you need to listen. I mean, you have to really check all of that at the door and say, okay, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about evolution? What are your beliefs? And instead of just, some people sit and they wait and wait and wait and wait and wait just to jump into a conversation and they don't ever really hear anything. It's the same kind of thing. If you really want someone to listen to you, you have to first listen to them. And so I tell people, have that conversation. If somebody says they don't accept evolution, say, okay, well, tell me why. Tell me your story. The greatest part of my research over the last 7 years has been collecting stories from people all over the South, and really, it's expanded out of the South now, regarding their experiences with evolution. And there is a rich history there. People will tell you their story if you sit there and listen to them and you're respectful of it, because it is important. It is an identity construct. And so I've had people, pour into me about how, their mother told them that, evolution was the devil, and that when it came up in class, they could not stay in that classroom. They had to leave. I had a future teacher crying to me one day because she said, I just can't teach evolution. She said, I can't teach it because if I teach evolution, I am going to cause my students to go to hell. Because in evangelical Christian tradition, it's not just about her being interested in her own mortal soul. Witness and testimony is a thing in evangelical Protestantism. So you're supposed to witness and share your testimony with others. And so if the testimony that you're sharing with others causes them to question their beliefs, then you, by virtue of that, are responsible for their souls. So, here we walk in the door and think, oh, you're just dumb. You don't accept evolution. You must not know about it. You don't teach evolution, so you must be dumb. But yet there is this whole other side, this whole other dynamic that exists there, this identity construct, this deeply seated fear, this actual living taboo. Evolution in a lot of places is a true taboo with fear of tangible consequences. And so, understanding that is what gives you the position from which you can then start talking to them about, well, okay, you believe this, you explain to me why you see things the way you do, or why you didn't teach evolution. You're talking to me about why you're afraid of it, or why you don't want to talk to me about it. And then I can tell you my story and we can start having a productive conversation. And so a lot of times, just the fact that you're willing to stop and listen makes a huge impact on the conversations that you're then able to have.
Yeah, because you just gave that person agency in the conversation where they might not have felt
Absolutely.
like they had any beforehand. So
mm-hmm.
That definitely does.
And there's a lot of judgment on both sides.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Go ahead. You were saying.
No, it's just there's a lot of judgment on both sides, and a lot of people, it seems like, again, like politics as well, there's a lot of shouting from both sides. There's not a lot of middle ground, but the middle ground is where all the magic happens. Is what I like to tell everybody, that's where these conceptual changes are taking place. That's where the rubber meets the road when it comes to wanting to have a major impact on what's going on with anything, is being able to see both sides, being able to recognize the value in the fact that that is someone's belief, that is someone's worldview, that is someone's identity. And it not being, again, it's not a war for me for evolution. It's a war for scientific literacy. So the idea of being right has to be out the door. It's not about me being right. It is about helping everyone understand and have interest in science and be able to think scientifically regardless of everything else, regardless of everything else, whether you're a devout Southern Baptist minister's kid or an atheist or a Protestant or, whatever Pastafarian, whatever flavor you happen to be, as long as you're scientifically literate, you're going to be able to walk out the door and use that. And evolution just happens to be a really good driver for getting at that science literacy.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great point. And, hopefully people can be out there and be sympathetic of everyone's backgrounds and help, to get everyone to be scientifically literate. Because not even just for evolution, just for so many other problems and issues that we're facing in today's world, we need the society to be scientifically literate so that way they understand these problems, because there is so many just misconceptions out there because the society isn't completely scientifically literate. So from climate change to evolution and everything beyond that, it definitely needs to happen for sure. So we're officially out of time. So I definitely want to thank everyone for tuning in. If we didn't get to your question, please send them to us via Twitter. And I definitely want to give a big thank you to Dr. Amanda Glaze for coming in. It's quite a fun topic. I think it's something that we can easily talk about for several more hours. So we'd love to hear everyone's stories. So definitely send in all those comments and questions to us via Twitter. But Amanda, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you. You are fantastic. Love the show. Keep watching it. So.
All right. Well, thank you. Yes, I mean we're going to keep going as long as we can for sure. So, but yes, if you enjoyed today's stuff, feel free to talk to us. Like I said, you can reach me at the Scicomm Monday handle or at my personal handle of Wildlife BioGal. You can reach Dr. Amanda Glaze at her handle of Evo PhD. Next week, we're going to be talking to Dr. Jeffrey Thompson. You can reach him at Dr. JJ Thompson on Twitter. And he does a lot of great work with pumas and jaguars down in the Gran Chaco region of South America. And if you've never heard of the Gran Chaco, which I admit I never had before I talked to Dr. Jeffrey Thompson, go look it up and find out, because it's a really cool region of South America. So, and then also we want to just make sure that we send out some big thank yous to all of our supporters on Patreon. We really, really appreciate all of your support. It definitely helps. And then a big special thank you to Jason Leathers. He goes by I for MSU on Twitter. He's one of our major Patreon sponsors, and it's really great to have your support, Jason. And then if you're interested in helping to support Scicomm Monday, please go to our Patreon site and become one of our Patreon patrons. It really does help us. That way we can keep the broadcast going. We even are hoping if we can get enough crowdfunding out there that we can be able to go and do some remote spots directly and watch people's research as it happens. So all of that funding goes to things like that. And then also for those of you who aren't really comfortable with Patreon, because that does a monthly donation. We also are doing a fall drive for GoFundMe, so that's just a one-time donation. And then for all the scientists out there who are fans of the show and you want to come on and share your science, or if you're a Sci-Commer and you want to just talk about doing outreach for everyone, please feel free to come on the show. We love being able to talk to everyone. We've talked to folks from all over the world, had them on, and it'd be great to have not just ecologists, not just evolutionary folks, anyone along the STEM background, please feel free to come on the broadcast. And so with that, I want to say thank you to everyone, and please go out, do some science, have some fun, and we'll see you on the next Scicomm Monday.